Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good evening to you all, and thank you all for coming on this lovely, wet and wonderful day. Very typical. Tonight at Al-Furqān Islamic Heritage Foundation, we're honored to host Professor Maribel Fierro to deliver a lecture entitled The Maghrib in the Mashriq. Before giving the floor to the speaker, I'd like to invite Mr. Sharaf Yamani, member of the Board of Directors, to offer some opening words on behalf of the Chairman of the Foundation, His Excellency Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. Please.
Good evening, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to tonight's lecture on behalf of our Chairman, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, and the Board of Directors of the Al-Furqān Islamic Heritage Foundation, as well as the trustees of the Yamani Cultural and Charitable Trust. Now tonight we embark on a voyage, a most enriching human voyage from London to Portugal and Spain. It is a voyage back in time to the era between 711 and 1492. It is more importantly an internal voyage into the depth of our human excellence. Our captain in this voyage is our guest speaker, Professor Maribel Fierro. We are honored to have her here with us. Thank you for coming, and we welcome her to her foundation. Tonight's lecture will shed light on the enduring legacy of the Al-Andalus, with a particular focus on how ideas and practices were conveyed and later found home elsewhere in the Mashriq, the Muslim East, and in the Islamic world at large. Now, whether you regard Al-Andalus as a historical period or a geographical area, it is historically held as one of the most important human chapters. Indeed, many historians consider it to be the true golden age of the Muslim civilization, and one that gave birth to unparalleled contributions in the worlds of arts and culture, science and medicine, law and jurisprudence, as well as many other intellectual and practical domains. But this was a world which has earned a somewhat mythical status, a nirvana culture, if you allow me, a world in which members of many different major religious communities, mainly Jews, Christians, and Muslims, collectively created a culture in which they lived in harmony and to which they contributed. The era produced some of the most significant scholars, poets, musicians, philosophers, historians, and thinkers of the medieval age, such as the poet and scholar philosopher Ibn Arabi, or Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes, whom had numerous writings in the fields of theology, medicine, astronomy, physics, law, and jurisprudence. Az-Zarqali, Arzakhel in Latin, the Arab Muslim instrument maker, and also mostly known as an important astronomer from the western part of the Islamic world. Al-Zahrawi, Abul Qasis in Latin. He is considered as the greatest surgeon in the Middle Ages, and he was called the father of surgery. And finally, as an example, Abbas ibn Firnas. Now, he came from Qurtuba to teach music. He then taught mathematical theory. Soon he became interested in the mechanics of flight. He constructed a pair of wings made out of feathers and a wooden frame, and he attempted to fly. This is 600 years before Leonardo da Vinci conceptualized his human-powered ornithopter. Now, legal historians also note that the first seeds of international law can be traced back to the works of the Andalusian Muslim jurists. In fact, here in the Al-Furqān Islamic Heritage Foundation, we are proud of establishing a center dedicated to the study of the philosophy of Islamic law, Maqasid al-Sharia. the idea and discipline conceptualized by Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi of Yativa, just south of Valencia, but who is buried in the former Nasrid capital of Granada. Centuries later, this very idea was brought to life, revived again by another great scholar, this time the Andalusian extract Muhammad al-Tahir bin Ashur. Recently, the Al-Furqān Islamic Heritage Foundation also edited and published one of the masterpieces of the Islamic Andalusian jurisprudence, Ibn Abdul Barr al-Qurtubi, and his book Kitab al-Tamheed. It gives me great pleasure and joy to announce to you all that Al-Tamheed's sister work, Al-Istidhkar, will also be published soon, inshaAllah. Now, the legacy of Al-Andalus is deeply ingrained into the Muslim psyche today, and it continues to flourish and endure, and this is reflected heavily in our more recent cultural and artistic outputs, all revealing our longing for that golden age. Like nearly a century ago, when Al-Allama Iqbal, the spiritual father of Pakistan, found himself in the Grand Mosque of Qurtuba, where he wrote his famous poem, Masjidi-i-Qurtuba. And Ahmad Shawqi's Siniya poem entitled The Journey to Al-Andalus, as well as the Lebanese singer Fayruz and her singing Lisanuddin al-Khatib's Jaddak al-Ghaythu, or the late poet Nizar Qabbani's poem Ghirnata. Memories of Al-Andalus lingers on widely in the Muslim and Arab mind through the melodic and euphonic Muwashshahat al-Andalusiyya, or the perfect and sublime architecture, art and serenity of areas like the gardens and palaces of Al-Hamra, or the many collaborative, creative inventions, ideas and theories from the residents of this great era. One can only conclude that Al-Andalus was a human triumph that symbolized the heart of who we are and how we should coexist. This long-lost European Muslim civilization, whose existence changed the cliches about unbridgeable civilizations, remains a Mecca, a goal, a solution, or really a formula for all our contemporary issues today, pertaining to religious thought, migration, common law, identity and belonging. And although this cultural dreamland no longer exists, its intellectual spirit and creative energy lives on in many new adaptive forms in distant lands. I'm extremely excited to hear Dr. Maribel Fierro's talk. I thank you all for being with us, and I leave the floor for the introduction of our esteemed and valued speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharaf. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Maribel Fierro tonight. Professor Fierro has devoted the majority of her academic work to the study and the unearthing of all that relates to the Andalus. With a PhD from Madrid University, she has held a number of professional, teaching and research positions both in the Mashriq and the Maghrib. Research professor at the Institute of Languages and Cultures of the Mediterranean in Spain, she has worked and published on the political, religious and intellectual history of Al-Andalus and the Islamic West. She has written extensively on Islamic law, the construction of orthodoxy and the persecution of heresies, on violence and its representations in medieval Arabic sources. Her current research projects are practicing knowledge in Islamic societies and their neighbors, and local contexts and global dynamics, Al-Andalus and the Maghrib in the Islamic East. Among her publications, the Almohad, the Muwahhid Revolution, Politics and Religion in the Islamic West during the 12th and 13th centuries, and Abdurrahman III, the first Cordoban Caliph. Professor Fierro has a lengthy string of journal articles attached to her name, and has worked on more recently she's worked on some edited volumes, including the legal status of dhimmis in the Islamic West, and with that magisterial work, Ibn Hazm of Cordoba, the life and works of a controversial thinker. In more recent years, her work has taken a slight turn, I would say, in that she has focused on more timely topics, but with an Andalusian lens, tapping into Andalusian perspectives always. She has worked on both wings of Al-Furqān Foundation's interests. That is to say, she has published some edited manuscripts, but also ventured into the Maqasid front, where she has written extensively on Ibn Rushd's book, or project perhaps, Bidayat al-Mujtahid, the distinguished jurist primer, which arguably was a pioneering work and move towards codifying Islamic law, a subject that is joined at the hip with notions of maqasid, or the philosophy and higher objectives of the law. Quite recently, I recall picking up a volume by the late Moroccan Allama Muhammad bin Sharifa, Ibn Rushd Sira wa Tha'iqiyya. Those of you familiar with Andalusian studies will recognize this name immediately. I picked it up only to read the dedication to, as he put it, Sultanatul Ilmi wal Bahth, the Sultana of scholarship and research. We are pleased to have Professor Fierro here, and we are looking forward to see what she has to say about the Maghrib in the Mashriq. Professor Fierro, please.
Good evening. I'm extremely grateful to Al-Furqan Foundation and to those who have made possible that I'm here today for the opportunity of presenting here the project on which I am presently working. And this opportunity reminded me how old I am, and also how lucky I was, because 28 years ago I was in the first public event of Al-Furqan Foundation, thanks to Professor Juan Bernet, who knew that I was working at the time. I worked on it for almost 20 years, on I will explain it later, on a history of the works written and transmitted in Al-Andalus, and I was reading catalogs, and he told me about this foundation, and he proposed my name, so I was able to come here to this wonderful event. I mean, it was wonderful from the scientific point of view, but we were also invited to have dinner to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I will remember that for the rest of my life. It was just something incredible. So, as I said, I was here thrilled to be part of the launching of a project that was very close to my interest. I was building a database of all the works written and transmitted in Al-Andalus from the 8th to the 15th century. The information collected came from different sources, and one of them, of course, were catalogs of manuscripts. Al-Furqan's investment in updating old catalogs and bringing to light new ones was great news for me. I think I've read them all. Part of my life was spent reading catalogs of manuscripts, looking for Andalusi sources, mention of Andalusi books. And I was, as I said, I was searching for data regarding the circulation of works written in Al-Andalus or copied by Andalusis throughout the Islamic world. Now I'm doing the same, but this time looking for information related to the Maghreb, to North Africa. It took me a while, and this has to do with the way the history of Al-Andalus is taught in my country. I'm Spanish. It took me a while to understand that in order to really get a good understanding of the history of Al-Andalus, I had to go to North Africa, because without North Africa, Al-Andalus cannot be understood. So I'm therefore doubly thankful to Al-Furqan Foundation that has allowed me to find the data I was looking for, my history of the authors and transmitters of Al-Andalus, and gives me now the opportunity to talk about a related project. The project that I'm going to talk about today deals with the medieval Islamic West in the East, or in other words, the Maghrib in the Mashriq. It is a project closely related to a previous one that was funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. This previous project was entitled Practicing Knowledge in Islamic Societies and Their Neighbors, and it is being carried out since 2014 until yesterday. It ended at the end of March, thanks to the concession of the Annelies Mayer Award in 2014. My presentation deals, as I said, with a project that I have recently started together with my colleague from Granada, Maite Penelas. This is our center in Granada. It's the Escuela de Estudios Árabes in an old Morisco house. It belongs to the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas, where I work. And the project, sorry, this was Maite. And this is the School of Arabic Studies in Granada. And the project we are directing is entitled Local Context and Global Dynamics, Al-Andalus and the Maghreb in the Islamic East, and is financed by the Spanish Ministry of Education. Very briefly, the aim is to study how, when, and why knowledge produced in the Islamic West, a context that tends to be considered local and even a periphery, especially North Africa, not so much Al-Andalus, spread in a wider context, that of the global Islamic community, and which changes were associated with that process. The domains of knowledge that we are taking into consideration in this first stage, we hope to continue it in the next years, are historiography, law, literature and poetry, and mysticism. And here you have the people who are collaborating in the project. My presentation is divided into 3 parts. In the first one, I will give some data about how the Maghreb or Islamic West has been conceived and represented both inside and outside it. In the second part, I will present a list of works written in the Maghreb, and more specifically in Al-Andalus, works that spread all over the Islamic world, and so that I will call them bestsellers, even if it's not a very good term, and I will explain the resources thanks to which I could prepare this list of bestsellers. Finally, in the last part, I will deal with the textual and contextual reasons that explain why such works produced in the Maghreb became popular elsewhere, because it's not taken for granted that what was going on in the Maghreb was of any interest outside it. So I start with the first part. The Maghreb, as you know, is the Arabic term generally used in geographical and historical sources to refer to the Islamic lands west of Egypt. Ibn Khaldun remarked that the general denomination Al-Maghrib was applied to a particular region, the extent of which varied according to the different authors. For example, Al-Muqaddasi in the 10th century included under Al-Maghrib not only northern Africa west of Egypt, but also Sicily and Al-Andalus. But the majority of authors reserved the name only for northern Africa, as in the case of another 10th century geographer, Ben Hawkal. Geography and political framing in the past sometimes coincided and sometimes did not. The geographical Maghreb, that is the region named Al-Maghrib in the geographical sources and the Iberian Peninsula, saw the formation of different political entities that united or separated regions and towns. The Almoravids united what is called the Maghrib al-Aqsa, which roughly corresponds to today Morocco, and Al-Andalus during their rule that lasted from around 1050 to 1147. So that at this point of time, of course, Al-Andalus was part of the Maghreb politically. Then came the Almohad Empire from around 1130 to 1275, and they established political unity for the first time in the whole area. The collapse of the Almohad Empire saw the emergence of regional post-Almohad dynasties, which is the context in which Ben Khaldun was born and lived, that lasted until the end of the 15th century. This is the period we deal in our project, from the Arab conquest to the end of the 15th century, which is when Al-Andalus ceased to exist. I have mentioned that the Almohads for the first time politically united the Maghreb. Having been born as a Berber nativistic movement, the Almohads emphasized, especially in the first decades of their rule, the Almohads was a project that underwent changes through time. They emphasized at the beginning a common Maghribi identity as against the Mashriq, to the extent that the Maghreb was considered by the Almohads to be the new center of the Islamic world. The Almohads could do that because their movement had been started by a charismatic messianic figure, the Mahdi ben Tumart, who was an infallible imam and the head of the station of prophecy and infallibility. And thus he ensured that knowledge, ilm, was now in the Maghreb. Thus, Maghribis were not any longer in need to travel to the east to acquire knowledge. Until that time, Maghribis had a sort of inferiority complex, so that they had to travel. We'll see how much they traveled to the centers, to the central lands of Islam. But with the Almohads, he sort of thought that now they had something to say, and that what they were saying was important. Even at the beginning of the Almohad period, the Almohads seem to have considered that it was not any longer necessary to travel to the east for pilgrimage. They had their own sanctuary in Timmal, where Ben Tumart and the Almohad caliphs were buried. This underwent changes as the Almohad caliphate went on. No monographic study, to my knowledge, exists on the perceptions and representation of the Western lands of the Islamic world, both from within such lands and outside them. What I will mention now is just a brief overview of how the Maghreb was represented in the Islamic imaginary, and I hope that by the end of the project we'll be able to produce a monograph. Between the 16th and the 19th century, in European geographical and political maps, the lands of North Africa west of Egypt are referred to as Barbary. The name is derived from the Arabic term barbar, applied to the local peoples of the region, the Berbers, not a name they use for themselves. The Berbers didn't call themselves, of course, Berbers. As has been indicated already, the term was probably an abusive and contemptuous epithet used in Greek, barbaroi, and in Latin, barbari, as well as in Arabic, to refer to peoples who spoke languages different from your own, usually seen as non-intelligible and somewhat lacking. The Latins were doing the same with the barbars, the barbarians of the north, the German people. This meant that the Berbers were constructed as a people on the basis of their language and languages. Ramzi Rui has recently explored how the term came into being and the decisive role played by the Andalusians in its use and extension, proposing that it was in Al-Andalus where the invention of a North African people called the Berbers took place. Al-Andalus, contrary to North Africa, became Arabized quite early, and by the 12th century it is generally accepted that Arabic was the predominant language in the Iberian Peninsula. Instead, North Africa was predominantly Berber-speaking, especially in the central and extreme Maghreb, and it is only from the 12th century onwards that Arabization started to gain speed in this region. That was caused, paradoxically, by the Almohads. I said before that it was a Berber nativistic movement, but paradoxically it was the Almohads who promoted the Arabization of North Africa, because they incorporated into their armies the Arab tribes, the Banu Sulaim and the Banu Hilal, that they defeated in what is now Algeria, and by incorporating them they started moving them towards what is now Morocco. And from this time onwards, because there were Arabs settling in Morocco, before there were very few Arabs who had settled there, many settled in Al-Andalus, and that's the reason Al-Andalus became Arabized. The Arabization of what is now Morocco and also the central Maghreb took speed. To the negative associations of the term Berbers is to be added the fact that the Berbers had offered strong and sustained resistance to the Arab conquest, and that they had also been receptive to doctrines such as Kharijism and Shiism, considered deviant by the Sunnis. This did not help in developing a positive representation of the Berbers in Sunni sources. The Berbers became the epitome of the wild and civilized people. As pointed by Rui, the Andalusi contribution to this negative image was huge. Because of political events in the Iberian Peninsula, including the fact that the collapse of the Cordoban Umayyad Caliphate was seen as the result of a civil war caused by the unruly Berbers who had been incorporated into the Caliphal army, so that the period of the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba is known historiographically as the Fitna Barbariya. Here there are a few examples of the Andalusi stereotyping of the Berbers as the other. The Granadan poet Al-Sumaysir in the 11th century said, I'm quoting, "I saw Adam in my dreams and I told him, O father of humankind, people believe that the Berbers are your descendants." Adam answered, "If that was true, I would repudiate Eve." End of quote. In the same century, the famous Saeed Tulaituli, in his History of the Scientific Achievements of Humankind, he included the Berbers, also the Galicians in the north of Spain, among the people without reason and without science. The Almoravids, depicted as rude camel drivers from the desert who behaved like women because they veiled their faces, were derided by the Andalusi poets as unable to appreciate Arabic poetry. They were not Arabized, they could not understand, they had their own poetic traditions. The negative image of the Maghreb and of the Berbers is also found in the East. The geographer Ben Fakih al-Hamadani provided a visual demonstration of this by depicting the Surat ad-Dunya, the image of the world, as a bird consisting of 5 parts, each individually representing a part of the world. The head symbolizes China, India the right wing, the hazard the left wing, the chest, that is the heart and the center, corresponds to Mecca, Hijaz, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Finally, the 5th part is the tail, corresponding to the Maghreb. And the geographer adds, and the worst part of a bird is its tail. Writers favorable to the Berbers could not but react to this negative image. An Ibadi author counteracted Ben Fakih al-Hamadani's dismissal of the Maghreb as the tail of a bird by stating, the bird is a peacock. In a work compiled between the 12th and the 13th centuries to praise the achievements of the Berbers, and thus entitled Kitab Mafakhir al-Barbar, it is stated that the reason to compile it was because the Berbers were considered by many as the people the most perverted, the most ignorant, the most devoid of qualities, and the most deprived of virtuous acts, a false representation that needed to be corrected. Genealogies became crucial resources, especially the insistence that the Berbers originally came from the Mashriq and that they were related to the Arabs. But the negative image, the negative representation was so prevailing, so powerful, that we find it even in Ibadi sources. Ibadism was a branch of Harijism, a doctrinal and political movement in early Islam characterized by its equalitarian approach. To be a Muslim was what was relevant, not the ethnic background. Ibadism is spread in North Africa among the Berbers, and it is in Ibadi literature that we find the earliest examples of depictions of the Berbers in favorable terms. In an Ibadi source, an Ibadi Berber called Nafath managed to outwit the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad by playing with such a negative representation and reversing it. Nafath told the Abbasid Caliph, "Prince of the believers, I am a Berber and Berbers are not well educated, but I would like that you allow me to speak in your majlis." The Caliph asked several questions and Nafath answered all of them. The notables, the jurists, and the scholars of Baghdad also posed him questions until they could not think of any other. The Caliph looked at Nafath, surprised at the extension of his knowledge in spite of his appearance. He looked like a Berber, his genealogy and his scarce education, and said, "Excellent honey in an ugly container." If Berbers were portrayed negatively, and if Maghribis were predominantly of Berber stock, were the two conflated? Were Andalusis, who took pride in presenting themselves as Arabs, assimilated or differentiated in relation to the Maghribis? As mentioned, there are few studies exploring how the Maghreb and Al-Andalus were represented outside the region. This is now changing, not only because of our project, but because there are other people working on this topic. And this has to do partly with the fact that during the period here considered, this bad image of the Maghreb, few Eastern scholars, very few, traveled to the West from the 8th and the 15th century, and even fewer wrote about what they saw and what they thought about it. This contrasts especially with the fact that many Maghribis traveled to the East as travel for study. The Rihla fi Talab al-Ilm was a prominent feature in the rise of the scholarly milieus of the Islamic West. And here you find, you get an idea of how many Andalusis were traveling during this, between the 9th and the 11th century. And they were traveling more than from other peripheries. Here, this is a study by Monique Bernards that shows how during the same period 62 Andalusis were traveling to the east, whereas from Khorasan only 10. This is very interesting. I cannot deal with it now in more deep. Easterners had access to information about the view Andalusis and Maghribis had of themselves through those writings produced in the Islamic West that made their way to the East. But this was not the only channel. Many Andalusis and Maghribis settled in the East for different reasons. Here, of course, there were also the famous travelers like Ibn Jubayr and Ben Battuta. Of these Andalusis who traveled to the East, some of them wrote their travels, and the Rihla is very much a Maghribi genre. Even there are people who say that it was invented in Al-Andalus. Easterners had access to information about the view Andalusis and Maghribis had of themselves through those writings produced in the Islamic West that made their way to the East. But this was not the only channel. Here I'm going to use information from an online, open access online database, the prosopography of the Ulama of Al-Andalus, which is based in our center in Granada, and which collects information about almost 12,000 Andalusi ulama. And with this database, we can do many more things. I will only show this. This gives you an idea of all the places that Andalusis traveled to during from the 8th to the 15th century, and many settled in these regions. Some of those migrants produced books aiming at a local audience interested in Maghribi matters. This kind of production also awaits a monograph, with some authors having enjoyed privileged attention, most especially Al-Makkari, who between the 16th and the 17th century wrote a huge compilation in order to satisfy the demand for Andalusi matters that existed in Syria, especially after the loss of Al-Andalus to the Christians. But there were other authors, such as Al-Humaydi, a student of Ben Hazm, whose Jadwat al-Muktabis was written in Baghdad and put into circulation information about Andalusi religious scholars, men of letters and poets. On his part, the Andalusi Al-Yasa Ben Hazm wrote Al-Maghrib during his stay in Egypt to stir the interest and perhaps also stimulate military intervention on the part of Saladin. If we move to popular literature such as the Sirat Baibars, a number of Maghribi characters appear, especially sailors, saints, exiled princes, merchants, and pilgrims. Maghribis as magicians are mentioned frequently in Eastern sources, and this has to do with the fact that the works on magic by a Maghribi author, Ahmad al-Buni, who died in 1225, he was a magician but he was also a Sufi, became famous. A negative aspect of the representation of the Maghreb in Eastern sources is the association of Maghribis with the use of violence. They are portrayed as using the whip, for example, to make believers perform their prayers correctly. and the model is Umar bin al-Khattab. But the Maghribis also became famous in the East for their knowledge of Quranic readings and also for the writing of creeds, to the extent that the writing of Aqidas was considered one of the arts of the people of the Maghreb. The association with Sufism was widespread, given the great success that Maghribi Sufis had in other Islamic lands, often accompanying their migration and settlement outside the Maghreb. This leads to the query: which kind of works produced in the Maghreb made their way to the Mashriq? Do they fall within these three categories? Now I move to the second part. Studies conducted on the practice of traveling for study, usually associated to pilgrimage, have shown, as we have seen, a predominance of Maghribis as against those traveling to the central lands of Islam from the eastern periphery, at least for some periods and disciplines. When talking about the genre of the Rihla, the works written by two Maghribis that I mentioned before, Ben Jubair and Ben Battuta, come immediately to mind. But they were not popular books before the modern period, if we take into account the scarce number of manuscripts that have come down to us, around 4 manuscripts for Ben Jubair, 2 in the case of Ben Battuta. These are modern bestsellers, both outside and inside the Islamic world, with many editions and translations now into different languages. Catalogues of Arabic manuscripts preserved in libraries around the world reveal that certain works enjoyed great popularity through the centuries, and that makes the reading of catalogues very entertaining if you look for certain things. Works that are found in almost every library holding Arabic manuscripts, as well as those of which many copies are found in libraries of specific regions of the Islamic world, I will call them bestsellers, of course without implying that what we have here are the same mechanism, dynamics, and circuits of production, sale, circulation, and consumption that we find with the modern bestsellers. But I want to evoke this idea of popularity. A better expression would be best copied, so that was suggested to me when I gave a related talk at the University of Göttingen. But bestseller conveys the idea of a work that for some reason enjoys a certain degree of popularity, and it is in this sense that I will use it to refer, as I have said, to works that are found in almost every library holding Arabic manuscripts, as well as those of which many copies are found in libraries of specific regions of the Islamic world. The first are global bestsellers and the second local bestsellers. I also consider bestsellers and books or works that gave rise to a substantial associated production, abridgment, commentaries, glosses, versifications, translations throughout the century. Quotations could be another criteria to identify bestsellers, and projects such as Kitab, directed by Sarah Savant with the financing of the European Union, that analyze text reuse through digital humanities, will help us in this domain in the near future. Now I would like to ask you to think about which, if any, book comes to your mind that could be called a Maghribi bestseller in the Islamic world. So just try to think. And here I'm going to present you my list of the top 10 bestsellers produced in the Islamic West. And this is listed in decreasing order according to their number of manuscripts. First, there is the Shifa by Qadi Iyad. Second, there is the famous Shatibiyya on Quranic readings by Ash-Shatibi. You see there the numbers of manuscripts. These are approximate figures. These are the figures that are found in my database that I will talk about immediately. But when you study a work, and you find many more manuscripts. So these are approximate numbers. Then the Alfiyya, also on grammar. Then the Kitab al-Jami on simples by Ben al-Baitar. Then a work on alchemy, the Rutbat al-Hakim by Maslama ben Qasim. Then the famous tafsir by Al-Qurtubi, a work on mathematics by Al-Khalasadi, the Mirror for Princes, the Siraj al-Muluk by At-Turtushi, the Urjuzat al-Wildan, and finally another work on grammar by Ibn Jurrum. Just some brief comments regarding this list. I don't know if you've been surprised to find these titles and not others. This is my list. It has been possible to make this list thanks to the data collected in the history of the authors and transmitters of Al-Andalus, which is based on Brockelmann and Sesgin's Geschichte. I always bless these men for what they did. And I followed their example, but just for Muslim Iberia, collecting information about the works that were written and transmitted from the 8th to the 15th century in the Iberian Peninsula. And it can be consulted, open access. Now it looks like a book, but very soon is going to be accessible as a database. It is divided into 15 sections that, if you are familiar with Sesgin Geschichte, you will recognize, with some specificities, like the section 14, which is on Faharis, because the literature on Faharis on bibliographical repertories was so abundant in Al-Andalus that I had to put a special section for it. And the question is why this was so popular. Another question with no answer for the moment. So here you have an example of how the information you will find in this database. This is an entry taken from the section of mysticism. Here is an author of the 9th century. He wrote a Kitab al-Ubbad, which is lost. You won't find any reference to any manuscript. And then you will find the works that this Cordovan author in the second half of the 9th century had learned in the East, and he was bringing back to Al-Andalus. The work of Ibn al-Mubarak, the Kitab al-Fitan by Nuaym ben Hamad, and so on. Here there is a contemporary of Ben Waddah, the famous Sufi Ben Masarra, who wrote a Kitab al-Huruf, among many others. And here we have a manuscript which is in the Chester Beatty Library, probably also one copy in the Sulaymaniya. It has been edited and translated. So this is how the information is given. Thanks to this resource, quantitative studies can be undertaken. For example, the number of works that were circulating in the Islamic West around the year 250 of the Hijrah and their titles. And here you find that, of course, fiqh is the discipline more represented. And what I found interesting is that at this time, very early time, we are by the middle of the 9th century, the conquest had taken place in 711, in 92 Hijrah. By this time, there were, we can trace 123 fiqh books circulating in Al-Andalus, and already at this time, more than 90 have been written by the Andalusis. Of course, written has to be explained, because these are mostly compilatory works. But the Andalusis were doing the same that the Easterns were doing at this time. And a local production very soon was taking place, adapting all these materials to the context in which these Andalusis were living. And I was very surprised when I saw these results. Another possibility is to find out when compilations of fatwa took place. The Maghrib is very much associated with fatwa compilations, but when you look when they are being compiled, you find that it's at very specific moments, and there are many long periods in which nobody seems to care about compiling these materials. So, and this also gives a lot of room for thought. So thanks to this database, we can put things in certain ways and ask questions of why this is happening, and not to take for granted that genres were always popular and that specific contexts and political, economic, social are needed for certain works to be written. Of course, we know this, but at least now we can see these patterns. To draw these graphics, I've been helped by my colleagues at the School of Arabic Studies in Granada, thanks to their prosopographical database, which is a proper database and that you can consult online. So coming back to To the list, I have said that these are Andalusi bestsellers, but I'm tricky here because two authors, Qadi Iyad and Ina Jurum, were born in North Africa and the major part of their lives took place there. But they are included in Andalusi biographical dictionaries as Ghuraba, that is foreigners who resided, who settled in Al-Andalus, and if they are in a Andalusi biographical dictionary, then I consider them Andalusi Ghuraba. I am working now in producing a list of Maghribi bestsellers using another database, which is now being finished. Is the history of the authors and transmitters of the Islamic West, soon to be available also open access. This new list, of course, will also include Qadi Iyad's Ashifa, but will have at its top Al-Jazuli's Dalail al-Khairat. I was looking at this and I saw that Janjuz Vidkam was here talking about the Dalail. This was the bestseller produced in the Islamic world. That was a book that you find almost everywhere. So the topics of the works included in the list of the Andalusi's bestsellers are varied: Quran, the Quranic readings, Al-Qurtubi's Tafsir, the Prophet's Sirah and Fadail, Qadi Iyad's Ashifa, the Profession of Faith and the Five Obligations, the Urjuzat al-Wildan, Grammar, which is very represented with two works, what we can call Sciences of the Ancients, Ibn al-Baytar's work on Simple, Alchemy, the Rutbat al-Hakim, and Al-Qalasadi's Kashf, and Adab and Politics, with Aturtushi Siraj al-Muluk. 5 are didactic works, and of these 5, 3 are didactic poems that deal with Quranic readings, grammar, mathematics, and the basic Islamic beliefs and practices. 3 of them have an encyclopedic character, dealing respectively with the merits and prerogatives of the Prophet, with medicine, and with the Quran. And 3 deal with non-religious sciences, and 2 with grammar. Finally, 6 of the 10 works were written between the 12th and the 13th century, that is, between the end of the Almoravid Empire and under Almohad rule. They are the ones that you see in the slide, which means that the majority of the bestsellers from Al-Andalus were written under the Berber empires. They were written in Al-Andalus by Andalusis, but were written because of a context that had been created by the Almohad Empire. They include the 3 didactic versifications and the 3 works that have an encyclopedic character. They represent 2 significant trends, encyclopedism and didacticism, that characterized the Almohad period. And with this I move to the last part of my talk. The Almohad period has been often understood as a period of violence and fanaticism, and there is no doubt that there was violence and imposition of what to believe. After all, the Almohads, as I explained, that had at their origins a messianic figure, Bentumart, who was capable of knowing the truth. Bentumar's creed was the correct one, and all those living under the Almohad rule had to learn it, forcing all of them, Jews and Christians, but also non-Almohad Muslims, to convert to the Almohad understanding of belief in God, with the Aqidah of Bentumart. The Mahdi had ushered a new age, an event that was made visually omnipresent by the coins minted by the Almohads, coins on which no date was mentioned, thus suggesting that a new era had begun. The shape of the coins they minted also indicated, in a simple but not simplistic way, I think this was really a marketing genius what they did with the minting of square coins, because in a very simple way they indicated very clearly that something new was happening. The square coins and the combinations of squares and circles are shapes that became closely associated with the Almohads, as shown in their flags and also in their copies of the Quran, with a very specific square format. All this contributed to impress on the minds of their subjects that something new had arrived, something that was equal to the Amr Allah, God's order for mankind. The new word brought by the Almohads was represented in different ways, one of them being the return to the original Abrahamic monotheism. The figure of Abraham, who by contemplating the stars reached an understanding of God, is echoed in one of the first works written under Almohad rule, Bentufail's Hay Ben Yaqdan. Rational inquiry and interest in philosophical reflection was promoted by the successors of Bentumar, the Muminid caliphs, with Averroes being charged with a commentary of Aristotle's works. I have mentioned two Almohad scholars whose names are familiar to any educated reader today, Bentufail and Averroes. Two other Maghribi scholars should also be mentioned, Maimonides and the Sufi Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. All of them were trained in Almohad times, and their training was decisive in their intellectual production that they mostly carried out in the East where they settled. What all of them have in common is their search for the foundational principles, the usul, of the topics they dealt with, being concerned not only with compiling everything that was known until that moment of each discipline, but most importantly with establishing the general principles of those disciplines, as Averroes did in his not philosophical works such as the Kulliyat on medicine and the Bidaya on law. Also, Maimonides, another scholar trained under the Almohads, also looked always for the usul. Averroes openly directed his criticism against those scholars who were too attached to the opinion of their predecessors and thus measured knowledge by quantity, not quality, comparing them to shoemakers who accumulate huge amounts of shoes of different sizes, so that if a customer came, he will look for the shoe that was his number, but they were unable to make a shoe of the size required. That thinkers of such caliber were active very close to each other, in my view, is not a coincidence. They all belong to a context in which intellectual innovation was promoted. The four of them can be connected to the Talaba, the intellectual elites sponsored and salaried by the Almohad caliphs to substitute the old scholarly establishment. The Almohads are now more and more acknowledged as having set in motion a sophisticated political, religious, and intellectual experience that mostly affected the Islamic West, but that also influenced Latin Christendom, Judaism, and the Islamic East in ways still to be fully explored. Against this context, what do the Andalusi bestsellers written in Almohad times tell us about their intellectual project? First of all, it's related mostly to education, and we see first in the field of grammar. Ben Malik and Abjurrum's works were intended as introductory texts to the study of grammar, as was another work written at the time, the Muqaddimah of Al-Jazuli, which is a local bestseller. These were texts that catered to the need of providing training to the grammar of the Arabic language to students, many of whom came from non-Arabic linguistic backgrounds and who needed to master Arabic in order to perform their studies. The teaching of grammar had been the main component of the educational reform of Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, a famous Sevillian scholar who died in Almoravid times. He had stated that the procedure normally followed, consisting in starting to teach children the Quran so that they memorize a text that they could not understand, was wrong and led to many problems, among them an incorrect understanding of their religion. He proposed that the study of Arabic grammar should become the starting point of the pedagogical process and then move to the Quran. Different studies have shown that under the Almohads, the number of grammarians greatly increased and that their professional opportunities widened. For example, grammarians were named judges because it was thought that they needed to understand the grammar, the Arabic text correctly in order to reach just sentences. The flourishing of grammatical studies under the Almohads can also be linked to the need to improve and speed the training of those Almohads who had a Berber background. The grammarian Ben Mada proposed to simplify the way Arabic grammar was taught, emphasizing the pedagogical need to suppress complicated arguments. This man was the tutor in charge of the education of the Muminid princes, the children of the first Almohad Caliph and of those of the Almohad Shuyukh, all coming from Berber-speaking families. This educational context should be taken into consideration when analyzing his proposal that was revived, for example, in Egypt in the 20th century as maybe helping to increase literacy in Arabic. In the early Almohad period, the use of the Berber language in rituals, teaching, and political communication is well attested. Works related to this use were written, for example, an Arabic Berber dictionary, so that there was also the need to cater for the need of the Berber-speaking population. But for all its initial Berber nativism, as I had already mentioned, the Almohads ended up promoting the Arabization of the Maghreb. Now I move to the second aspect, encyclopedism and didactic poems. Under the Almohads, we can detect not only an increased interest in grammatical studies, but also a flourishing of encyclopedism and an increase in the writing of didactic verses. The concern for compiling extant knowledge in well-organized and user-friendly works can be detected in almost every field. And I think here lies the success of Al-Qurtubi's tafsir, which is very user-friendly and which gives you a lot of information. But we can find this kind of works in every field, in botanics, in adab, in medicine, in astronomy, in agriculture, in magic. Professor Endres has indicated that Averroes can be considered an encyclopedist in the rational sciences. And I think the same can be said of Ibn Arabi in the field of Sufism. As regards the writing of didactic poems or versifications, Membalik's Alfiya, although written in the East, is an indication of the mastery already reached in the Maghreb in such a genre. It is the same with Ashatibiyya, started in Al-Andalus before Ashatibi's emigration. Didactic poems were written in Al-Andalus before the Almohads, but their number was scarce and many disciplines were represented. Then the Almohad period comes and we find didactic poems in almost every field. Of course, the use of didactic verses was not exclusive of the Almohads. The main function of such versified treatises was to facilitate the task of memorizing, although, as Van Gelder explains, the fact that the subject matter was compressed only in highly condensed form in the space of a relatively short text meant that, rather paradoxically, many such poems were far from being didactic in the modern sense of the word. But in spite of this, it seems that until quite recent times, young students were confronted with precisely such poems. And the surprising thing, I'm quoting Van Gelder, is that this seems to have worked in many cases. Now, why so many didactic poems? Because the Almohads needed to educate their own elites, the Talaba, and thus they promoted the composition of these didactic versifications. Not only them, the Malikis, who were considered heretics by the Almohads, also needed to react, and this Urjuzat al-Wildan, which is a local bestseller because it's deals with the 5 obligations of a Muslim in a Maliki context, so you find it only in Maliki areas. This was produced in the 12th century precisely to cater for the needs of the Malikis, to also promote the education of their own followers, and to counteract in this way the effort that the Almohads were doing in Almohadizing all the population of this Islamic West. So, how the Maghrib was conceived and represented both locally in the rest of the Islamic world and in the rest of the Islamic world is one of the aims of the project that I direct with Maite Penelas. The second aim is to document which works produced in the Maghreb captured an audience elsewhere as pre-modern bestsellers or as modern ones, which would be the case of Ben Battuta or Ibn Hazm. Finally, our aim is to analyze why such works became popular. Was it the contents? Was it the form? Was it a combination of both? Had it to do more with the author than with the work? What I have presented here are just some preliminaries of a project that we hope will be of wider interest for the study of Islamic intellectual life as it engages with the interplay between local and global contexts in the production of knowledge. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Fierro, for that. To use Sharaf Sued's wonderful, riveting rihla. I'd like to open the floor for questions and field any questions that you may have.
With the greatest respect, because it's my discipline, and that is architecture.
Okay.
We have a case where a certain element traveled from Iraq and Syria to the Maghreb, Andalusia, and it came back again, and it reached India. And that's fascinating. And I'm talking about the pointed arch and the lob arches within them. The pointed arch was invented in Iraq and Syria 300 to 400 years before Gothic architecture in Europe, although the Europeans believe that they invented the pointed arch, which is not true. And also, when I studied architecture in the 60s in London, I was told that the Romans invented the arch. When I started on my PhD thesis, I found out this is not true, because in archaeology, the arch was known in Mesopotamian houses 1800 BC, long before the Romans and the Greeks. Now, the fascinating thing is that when it traveled from Iraq and Syria into Morocco and then into Andalusia, they've added multiple lobes or teeth into the arch itself, and it's become also very pointed. And then you've got the pendentives added to it, and I found an example of this in the Moti mosque in the Red Fort in India, and that is fascinating, because before Islam, India did not know the arch. They have what we know as Trabeat structures, which is post and lintel, and therefore this is something, again, when we be the Maghribi should be very, very proud of. It is really fascinating for that business, and I thought I'm sorry, it's a different subject, but it is another aspect that really enhances the contribution of the East on the West and the West on the East, vice versa.
It's a related topic, and thank you very much. We are not dealing with art and architecture, we are not dealing with science, because there are other teams in my country that are dealing with this, especially in architecture and art history, and also in Barcelona with the history of science. And of course, one is tempted to write a kind of kitab al-awa'il for Al-Andalus, not the first things that were invented by the Andalusis and the first thing. But as you said, it's much more interesting to see what happens with these things, how they circulate, how they are adapted, rejected, assimilated, thought to be something that is the product of your own and not coming from outside. I always, when dealing with these topics with my students, I always tell them to think about the hamburger and the pizza. Everybody is happy with the pizza, nobody feels any anxiety, cultural anxiety about eating pizza, but hamburgers and Coca-Cola is different, no? So it's not the fact that it comes from elsewhere, it's the fact of how it comes and what we associate it with. So I think with this cultural transfer is we have to think also about hamburgers and pizzas and what's going on with them.
Somebody here had a question? I saw a hand.
It was the sort of coming down, slow down of the era in Andalus, and you said that they united the whole population there from different creeds, from different religions. But how is it that it started coming down? I mean, what was the...
Well, it was not the responsibility of the Almohads. The Almohads had started in southern Morocco among mountainous tribes.
Yes.
And they managed to create an empire, which is a very striking phenomenon, and they united for the first time the whole North Africa and Al-Andalus.
Yes.
And they were very powerful. I mean, they had a very powerful army that managed for a long time to check Christian advance. Then it changed, but for a while, the armies of the Almohads were terrifying for those who saw it. It was a movement, I won't call it totalitarian, but totalist. They had a Mahdi in their origin, the Mahdi ben Tumart, and when you have a Mahdi, you have the truth on your side. So having a Mahdi, they didn't have to explain why they were right.
But who appointed this Mahdi? I mean...
Oh, that's an interesting question. How are Mahdis appointed? Do they themselves, or usually it's their followers who give them this title, or who... Because they are charismatic figures. These are figures endowed with charisma, and to have charisma means that someone believes that you have charisma. If you are the only one who believes you have charisma, you don't start anything. So Ben Tumar was thought by many to be a very charismatic figure. So he had many followers, and with those followers created an army, and with this army an empire was built. And at the beginning, the Almohads were very sure of themselves that they had the truth and that everybody had to follow the truth that they were following. So everybody converted to Almohadism, not only Jews and Christians. This is one of the few cases in the Islamic history in which there was forced conversion. But the forced conversion didn't affect only Jews and Christians, also Muslims, because everybody had to become an Almohad Muslim. And this, which was, as I said, is associated with violence, and it also put in motion a series of phenomena that before had not taken place. And part of this is that we see that from the point of view of intellectual thought, things started to happen that before hadn't happened. As I said, I don't think that to have Averroes, Ben Tufail, Ibn Arabi, and Maimonides acting at the same time and doing similar things with all the differences is casual, it's not arbitrary. A context was created in which these things started to happen. I think it has to do with the moment in which Messianism, Mahdism was not any longer enough for legitimizing Almohad rule, so Almohad rulers started to move to philosophy and started to promote rational inquiry. Because as we know, thanks to Weber, charisma is very difficult to maintain. So you need to find a substitute for the initial charismatic, messianic, violent origins of the Almohads. And what they tried for a while was philosophy. And that's when they asked Averroes to comment on Aristotle's works. So something happened that these Berbers that are usually associated with fanaticism, with ignorance and so on, when I come to think about what is the most interesting, innovative and vital period of Al-Andalus, it's under the Almohads.
But do you
You
think
come
that
to the Almohad period and you see things happening that you don't see before.
But do you think this is the beginning of the downfall when they have this fanaticism, this violence?
No,
You know,
that has nothing to do with
No.
what the Almohads were doing. That had to do with the way the military problem was solved differently by two different societies. Christian societies in the north were societies organized for war, and Al-Andalus was not a society organized for war, because contrary to what is normally held, jihad was not very much on the minds of the Andalusis. They were mostly peasants, they were interested in commerce, they were interested in cultivating their lands, they were not interested in taking up arms, whereas the Christian societies that had been formed on the frontier were societies organized for war, because
warriors, yeah.
they wanted to take a territory that was much better, that was more productive, where they could find more things. And also, historically, Muslim rulers are not happy with having their citizens or their subjects having arms. So rulers usually are not very happy with non-control or non-centralized jihad. So
Thank you.
so I will never put the blame on the Almohads for the loss of Al-Andalus. They managed quite well, then they didn't. So they also had a military problem, they ended up, but at the beginning their armies were terrifying. They were centralized. The number of people and of that they moved, I'm not a specialist in military history, but my colleagues who do, they say it was unbelievable. The capacity, the resources they had, because they established a very centralized government, they managed so many resources that they could put in motion armies that had never been seen before. In terms of
reason, according to you, for breaking down and then Muluk al-Tawaif, each one on his...
well, the Muluk al-Tawaif had been first. This is where the second Muluk al-Tawaif. The Almohads, well, the Almohads had too many, it was an empire, and empires usually have difficulties controlling all the parts of the empire. So they had to control Al-Andalus, they had to control Ifriqiya, Tunis, they had to control Morocco. In Morocco there were many other Mahdis who also wanted to take their share. So they had problems, as usually empires have.
Thank you very much. On your top 10 Andalusi bestseller list, you had at number 8 Al-Turtushi's Mirror for Princes. Could you say something a little about another Mirror for Princes that was that circulated at the time, Kalila wa Dimna, and the position that had in Almohad's intellectual society?
Kalila wa Dimna had circulated since very early times in Al-Andalus. It's very difficult to trace it because it's not mentioned in the bibliographical dictionaries. The database that I have built is based on biographical dictionaries, bibliographical dictionaries, and catalogs of manuscripts mostly. There are a number of works that do not appear in my database, which makes them very interesting because they seem to be circulating in other circles. So we have a kind of official view of what knowledge is about, which is given by the ulama, who are the ones who wrote the sources from which I have extracted. And there is other channels that are very difficult to trace, because for that I need to go to other kind of sources that I not usually have. I see some of these other works that are circulating when I go to the Moriscos, because the Moriscos, part of the control exercised by the ulama is gone. So we know through them, through their libraries, certain works that we never find quoted elsewhere. So there are currents that are very difficult to bring to light. It's not exactly censorship. I will call it more control of knowledge, so that the ulama only talk about those works that they feel at ease with. They may change through the centuries. In their polemics, we may find references to the books that they don't like, so we can know that they are also circulating, but there is always an area in shadow, which is the one that I'm more interested, but it's very difficult to recover. Through manuscripts, I mentioned the Rutbat al-Hakim. The Rutbat al-Hakim is a work on alchemy. The number of manuscripts that I have given is not the ones that are in my database. It's the ones that Godefroy de Calatay, who's working on it in another European project, has been able to find against what librarians in libraries in the Islamic world tell him, because they consider that this is a bad work and that is there. They don't destroy it, but they don't want it to be present. So he has been able to find information about these manuscripts through other channels. So there is a secret history of knowledge, if I will put it a kind of commercial title, that is very tempting, but is very difficult to recover. The Qalila wa Dimna is almost never mentioned in the sources that I have consulted, but is being quoted. That's the reason also the project by Sarah Savant is going to be so important, because she will be able to show the quotations that are found in other works without mentioning the title Qalila wa Dimna. Not mentioned.
Dr. Rahim?
All right. So, So a while ago, I read a remark in an unpublished work by a late 12th, early 13th century philosopher and physician who originates from North Africa, somewhere from North Africa, we're not exactly sure where, and then moves to Egypt and then moves to Khurasan. And in this remark, this is an autobiographical remark, and it's relatively brief, but he says basically that he describes his native land as tribal. He says it was ruled by tribes, qaba'il, as he puts it. And there was no scholarship, as he said, as he says, and that he then moved to Egypt, and from there he heard about someone in Khurasan, a good philosopher, so he moved all the way to Khurasan to study with him. So the way he portrays his native land is that it's the Wild West, and there's no scholarship, although ironically he was killed by the Mongols in Khurasan. So is this, and I was wondering, why didn't he go and study with Averroes, who was of course based in Andalusia and was well known there.
Well, if he's killed by the Mongols,
this is in Khurasan. This is before
the 13th century. This is by the middle of the.
No. It's so he was killed in Khurasan before they reached Baghdad.
Before they reached Baghdad.
Probably in Central Asia. Probably in. I'm not exactly sure. Probably in Khurasan. I'm not. So early 13th century. But he moved to Khurasan in the late 12th century, and so is this attitude common among Maghribi scholars, that they would move to the east because of such reasons?
There were many reasons for Maghribis and Andalusis at this time to emigrate. Some of those who did, they were not happy with the Almohads, so they might have been attracted by some aspects of the Almohad revolution, but some of them disliked other parts. So that was one of the reasons. What I have described about Bentufail, Averroes, of course I'm talking about a court setting. So that in this moment, and this is something that Montgomery Watt, I think, pointed quite with a lot of foresight of what was going on. When the Almohads moved from Messianism to philosophy, especially with Averroes, what they started was an educational program. An educational program takes a number of generations. So the idea was to expand knowledge and expand a certain way of doing inquiry, intellectual inquiry, but that required a number of generations. So that we find Imtufal seems to think this is not going to work, so let's go to the island and keep in the island. When you read Averroes is still very much he's very much in his philosophical work, dealing in a court setting, but he at the same time thinks, and I think his concern for education is very clear in his commentary on Plato's Republic. It has been pointed out that he's very much concerned with the educational role of the ruler, much more than previous philosophers. So I think he had a vision of a long, how do you say that in English?
A jury?
Long
vision.
A long term. There was short term, middle term, and long term. The problem was that Averroes had his disgrace. So that there is a moment in which Averroes is considered an heretic. The reasons for this, I think, are more internal than any other thing. It's not so much against philosophy, but it's very much more about the fact that the Caliph wanted to substitute the old tribal elites by the new elites that he has created. So there is a moment in which the Almohads had started as Berber tribes from the mountains, and they created the army, and they also created the first layer of a hierarchy. By the time of Averroes, we have an episode in which the Caliph gives the seat on his right to Averroes, taking out from there one of the tribal shuyukh. And this is previous to the moment in which the Averroes disgrace is taking place. So the tribes were very much present, and the tribes were not happy with the fact that the Almohad caliphs were given now more room to the intellectual elites that they were creating, and therefore were loyal to them, because the Almohad tribes derived their legitimacy to the fact that they had followed the charismatic figure. And what the Almohad caliphs wanted was to put them aside and to have only his own elites. Am I explaining myself? So the comments of your chap seems to fit with this model. What he's complaining is that the shuyukh, the Almohad shuyukh, the tribal leaders and the tribal followers, are making problems to the new elites.
In era, it's the same thing, just more power or grabbing for.
You have always to look to the different groups who want to get the power. Yeah. It's not always easy, but this is very interesting, this reference.
Thank you very much for the lecture, and thanks to Al-Furqān for allowing us this chance to listen to it. My question is regarding the Salah ad-Din. Many years ago when I was studying him, I came across the correspondence between him and Al-Muwahhid Sultan of the time, seeking establishing kind of military cooperation in the face of the Frankish attack on the Muslim lands, the Crusaders, which did not materialize.
No.
And when I was reading, there was a lot of debate and arguments among historians in the different periods, trying to understand the reasons for such failure. But since then I haven't chance really to go back to it. Did you come across, or is there any study recently which threw new lights on such venture?
Well, we have a recent work by Amar Baj about Saladin's military intervention in North Africa, which is very interesting, and the reasons for that, because apparently the procedence of gold from southern Egypt that had been from where the Fatimids had been taking their gold was stopped after the Ayyubids takeover of the Fatimid Empire, so that Saladin needed to find another source for gold, and the other source for gold was in West Africa. So he tried to intervene in North Africa in order to control also the commercial routes of gold. This is the argument that is done by Amar Baj. But I think another monograph that should be written is about Maghribis in Saladin's Egypt, because I think there is a lot of information that will give us an understanding also of Ayyubid policies. The Ayyubids, for example, adopted the square format of Almohad coins, which I find very surprising, and to my knowledge nobody has studied why they did that. So the influx of Maghribis in Ayyubid Egypt was huge, and we don't have a monograph on this, so this is something that should be written too.
Nothing on the call by Saladin to the Sultan to coordinate militarily,
well,
in terms of disrupting the routes of the Crusades.
Yeah, he asked the Almohad Caliph to help him in the maritime war against the Crusaders, and the Almohad Caliph said no. I think again because the Almohad Caliphs had so many fronts to attend that it was sometimes they could not reach every place. But this is
nothing new anyway.
Maybe there is something new, but this is not something on which I'm working.
Well.
But Saladin and the Almohads are a good topic for
All right,
research.
thank you very much.
Sorry, may I briefly thank you, Mr. Chair? I would like to thank you first, Professor, for this enlightening and fascinating journey, really. And also congratulating you on the impressive database that you are preparing. If I understand well, you are still in process of building that database,
The
or
one
it's almost
of
done now?
Al-Andalus is finished.
Okay.
The one for the Islamic West is still, that's much bigger and
Okay.
it's more complicated.
I mean, something probably I thought I'll discuss with you probably after the lecture, but I'd rather share it probably. It's a concern and it's a wish at the same time. So basically you mentioned your two databases, the one completed, the one that is ongoing, and there was another platform that you mentioned, a European platform. I would like to ask, what are the prospects of interlinking such databases, because very often we as foundations are accused of creating such databases which remain as isolated islands and not much interlinked. The reason I'm mentioning this is that we as a foundation are in process of building a modest database which is rapidly growing, mostly on bibliographical side of the story. So what are the prospects of, have you had any previous experience of interlinking such, and what are the prospects of interlinking something between these databases and our database in the future?
Well, my database and that of Granada are interlinked because, first of all, the database, I call it a database, but of Al-Andalus, but it's really in a Word format. When I was finishing it, I had the opportunity of talking with people from the King's College in Digital Humanities, and they were complaining exactly about this same thing, that people had started using different methods and it was very difficult to bring them together. So when I showed them what I had, which was just a Word file, they said, oh, this is perfect because this can be transformed very easily in everything. So I have kept it that way. So mine has no problems because it can be, it has no personality of its own. It can be converted in whatever thing. Now it's being converted to the same method of that they used in Granada, but I will keep the Word file so it can be transformed in everything. And the one that I'm doing for the Islamic West is also in the same, is a Word, these are Word files. Because as I said, I was aware of this problem, and that usually my colleagues in Granada started with doing this kind of work with the first computers. I don't know if you remember them, in the 80s. And things have changed so much that they also became trapped sometimes in using old technologies that could not be transferred. I don't like technology, so I kept it very simple. So mine is so simple that can be transformed into everything. It's a transformer, can be done anything with it.
So it's viewable?
Yes. Yeah. Probably I will also publish it as a book because it was my model was Sesgingsgeschichte, so it's a book. If you go now into the internet and look for it, you'll see that it's a book. You move pages and you can read it. It's not a database in that sense. It's a database because it contains a lot of data, but it's not a database like my colleagues in Granada. But now it will be also transformed into a database. But I will keep it as a book too.
Final question.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation of your data. My question would be, how does your data what can it tell us about the genealogy of Islamic political thought, and how we could trace it from the Maghreb, and if it had effect to the towards the Abbasid context?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking specifically in terms of like juristic works that kind of had the influence in connection with the other side. So from the Maghrib to the Abbasid, if that is clear.
Well, the Maghreb is associated with Malikism in terms of law, so that is we don't have a good history of the Maliki legal school, which is another desideratum that we have to do. When you mention the political aspect of Islamic law, because there is always the problem of imama, This is very, very tricky, because when you look for legal treatments of this doctrine, you usually find things that are repeated once and again. There doesn't seem to be much going on, much new going on. I think with the data that I have, I tend to think that the politics of the political information, you don't have really to look for political treatises. You have to look at the way knowledge is being structured in every period. That gives you a much better idea of what's going on. So that I think we have to map for each period what ulama are doing with the tradition, how they are giving more protagonism to certain genres as against others, and what is behind that. So this is hopefully something that we'll be able to do now thanks to this kind of information. The problem is that I don't have anything to compare that with, because to my knowledge there is nothing as exhaustive as what I have for Al-Andalus, for any other region of the Islamic world. There is Brokelman and Sezgin, but these are very broad. They don't put the focus so narrow into so I wish I had, for example, for Egypt, something similar, so that by comparing what is going on in Al-Andalus and what is going on in Egypt, then we can see how the world of knowledge is relating to different political systems. I think that will give us a much better understanding of what politics is about, because I think in Islamic societies you cannot study politics without studying, you have to study the rulers and the ulama always together. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
And on that note, on behalf of the audience here, I just want to say thank you very much, Professor Maribel, for that wonderful talk, and to all of you here, thank you very much for coming and attending.
Thank you for listening to me.